Okay, hi all. Today we'll be looking at the product and quotient rules as rules for finding more complicated derivatives. Let's start right here with the product rule. And let's take, for example, I have a function f of x is equals to 5x cubed multiplied by sine of x. The first issue you have to recognize and understand is when can you apply the product rule. You can apply the product rule whenever you have two terms that can stand independent of each other and are being multiplied together. One of the easiest ways to see that is to use parentheses. If I put the parentheses around the 5x cubed and the sine x right here, you can ask yourself, can these two terms stand alone? And the answer is yes. 5x cubed is just 5x cubed and sine x is just sine x. On the other hand, if I were to divide it this way, 5x cubed sine and then have the x by itself, well, we know a sine cannot stay by itself as it is a function. It must have an input variable. And so therefore, this right here is the incorrect splitting of the two functions. But once you have that ability to split it into two separate functions, we can use the product rule. The product rule is a rule to find limits without doing any more work, i.e. you don't need to know any more derivatives to find the product rule. I will call this 5x cubed right here the first function, and so I will call it f right here, and sine of x right here, I'll call that the second function right here, and I call that s. Now, what I will use right here is what's called a graphic organizer to help organize my information and help me get to my answer. So very simply, right here I make a little box. On the top first box right here, I put the first function, which is 5x cubed, and then below it I put f prime, which is 15x squared. And I have the second function that I'm multiplying or getting the product of together, and this right here will be your sine of x, and the derivative of sine of x, of course, is cosine of x. This right here is your s prime, your derivative. Very simply, to apply the product rule, you multiply these two together, and then the result you get, you add that to the product of the other two functions being multiplied together. And so from that right here, I have that f of prime of x, the derivative, is simply, think of it as making a little x for plus sign between them. And so you will have your 15x squared sine of x, and then you have your plus sign, and then multiply the other way across, 5x cubed multiplied by cosine of x. And that's your derivative. Of course, you can clean this up a bit. There are 5x squared in common, and so I can factor out that 5x squared, and that leaves me with 3 sine of x plus x cosine of x. And that right here is your derivative. The key and the power of the product rule is that you're breaking down your term into two simpler pieces and then finding the derivatives first. Once you've found that derivative, you just follow the nice little pattern across, add, and then across. And that'll always take you to your answer. The quotient rule is used when you, instead of multiplying, you have a division. And so let's say, for example, I have cosine of x being divided by e to the x, and I am trying to find the derivative. So let's go, f of x is equals to. Again, you use exactly the same graphic organizer. Your little box right here, your little box right here. Your first function, first one you see, is cosine of x, and the derivative of the first function, f prime, is negative sine of x. Your second function, therefore, is e to the x. And of course, by the way, use the quotient rule whenever you're dividing. i.e. quotient, divide. And right here, the derivative of e to the x, the easiest derivative of all, do nothing, and you will be successful. Right here. And it is time to find the derivative. The derivative f prime right here follows exactly the same system. You multiply these two together, but now you subtract instead. Quotient rule, subtracting, you think of dividing thing getting smaller. I can help you remember it right here. And after that, right here, you multiply these two together, right? And then you just have to remember that you have to square the denominator to complete the quotient rule. So again, the first part of my x is negative sine times e to the x, which is negative sine e to the x. Then minus, remember the quotient rule, you're subtracting instead of adding, which is what you do with the product rule. And then you do the other product, so then that will leave us with minus cosine e to the x. And the key thing to remember, the quotient rule, is that there's this extra step of dividing by the denominator squared. The thing is, the steps are basically the same. They're just two extra bits that you have to remember. You got to use that minus sign, and you got to remember you got to square the denominator. If you can just remember that, you can remember both rules immediately. Of course, we can clean this up a bit. From the top, I can factor out a negative e to the x, and so I will. And so that gives me negative e to the x, open parentheses, sine of x plus cosine of x. And the denominator becomes e to the 2x. You multiply the two together when you have a power to a power. And of course, I can cancel out an e. I have an extra e to the x in the numerator and in the denominator. So these cancel. And so that leaves me with my final answer of negative sine of x plus cosine of x divided by e to the x. Hopefully, this helps you get through your quotient and product rules much more easily.